Sometimes the greatest acts of kindness happen when no one is watching. For 15 winters, Thorlund walked through bitter snow to bring warm stew to the same beggar at his village gate. The figure never spoke, just took the food with trembling hands and disappeared into the storm. This winter was different. When Thorlund knelt to offer his gift, weathered fingers pulled back a hood to reveal a face from his past. It was Solveig, the lost queen thought dead for 15 years. Her voice still carried royal command when she said, "This kingdom still belongs to me." The woman Thorlund once served as a young guard had been hiding in plain sight. What had she been planning all these years, and why reveal herself now? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The frost clung to Thorlund's beard as he stood frozen in the swirling snow, staring into eyes that had haunted his dreams for 15 winters. Queen Solveig, alive, breathing, real, sat before him in rags that couldn't diminish the regal bearing she carried like armor. The wooden bowl of stew trembled in his weathered hands. "My queen," he whispered, the words catching in his throat like ice shards. Not anymore. Her voice held the weight of years and sorrows untold. Not for a very long time. The wind howled through the village gate, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. Thorlund's mind reeled backward through the years, to a time when this woman had commanded armies and shaped the destiny of the Northern Isles. To a time when he'd been young and proud to carry her shield. Solveig pulled the tattered cloak tighter around her shoulders. "You've grown into the man I knew you would become, Thorlund Eriksson. Your father would be proud." The mention of his father sent another wave of memory crashing over him. Magnus Eriksson, the greatest warrior poet the Northlands had ever known, had died in Solveig's service during the siege of Ravenshollow. Thorlund had inherited his father's war hammer, the great iron head carved with ravens in flight, but he had set it aside long ago in favor of farming tools and peaceful pursuits. How? The single word escaped him like a prayer. "We saw your ship burn. We mourned you properly. I myself cast your memorial stone into the sea." A sad smile crossed Solveig's weathered face. "And I have thought of that kindness often during these long years. But death, it seems, was not yet ready for me." The village behind them lay quiet under its blanket of snow, smoke rising from chimneys in lazy spirals. This was Thorlund's world now, a place of simple rhythms and honest work. He had built a good life here after the wars ended, a life centered around his wife Astrid and their son Eric. The boy was 17 now, strong and curious, with his mother's gentle wisdom and perhaps a hint of his grandfather's warrior spirit. Thorlund's farmstead sat at the heart of the village, not because he sought prominence, but because the people looked to him for guidance. They remembered that he had once stood at a queen's side, that he carried the blood of heroes. When disputes arose or decisions needed making, they came to his door. It was a responsibility he had accepted reluctantly, but carried faithfully. "You must come inside," he said finally, practical concerns overriding his shock. "The storm grows fierce." Solveig shook her head. "I cannot, not yet." "There are things you must know first, Thorlund. Things that will change everything. Then speak quickly before we both freeze. Do you know what has become of our land since my supposed death?" Thorlund's jaw tightened. "Jarl Grimvar rules now. The people suffer under his hand, worse than suffer. They starve while he grows fat on their labors. Villages burn when they cannot meet his demands. Children go hungry while he builds monuments to his own glory." The truth of it sat heavy in Thorlund's chest. Over the past 5 years, Grimvar's rule had grown increasingly brutal. What had begun as merely harsh taxation had evolved into outright tyranny. Just last month, the coastal village of Saltmere had been put to the torch when they couldn't deliver the demanded tribute of grain and silver. "I know," Thorlund said quietly. "We all know. But what would you have us do? Rise up? We are farmers and fishermen now, not warriors. The old ways died with—" He stopped himself. "With me." Solveig's eyes glittered in the dim light. "Perhaps it's time for the old ways to live again." Before Thorlund could respond, the sound of footsteps crunching through snow reached them. He turned to see Astrid approaching, her long blonde hair whipping in the wind, concern etched across her face. "Thorlund?" she called. "The storm worsens. You've been gone too long." His wife stopped short when she saw the woman seated against the gatepost. Astrid had heard the stories, had seen the painted murals in the old hall that depicted the legendary queen. Recognition dawned slowly across her features. "By the gods," Astrid breathed. "My lady." Solveig inclined her head respectfully. "You have chosen well, Thorlund. She has the look of strength about her." Astrid stepped closer, studying the woman who had been a myth for most of her adult life. "You're smaller than the stories made you seem." "Stories have a way of growing in the telling," Solveig replied with a hint of her old humour. "Though I was taller before the years bent my back." "Come," Astrid said decisively. "Whatever business you have can wait until you're warm and fed properly." "The wind speaks of death tonight." Thorlund saw his wife's natural compassion overriding caution, and his heart swelled with love for her. This was why their marriage had endured through 17 winters, Astrid's ability to see the human need before the political complication. Together, they helped Solveig to her feet and made their way through the village toward the farmstead. The queen, former queen, Thorlund corrected himself, moved stiffly, age and hardship evident in every step. How different she seemed from the woman who had once stridden through the great hall of Stormhaven, commanding generals and inspiring loyalty with her mere presence. Their home stood solid against the wind, built of good stone and timber with his own hands. Smoke poured from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows into the growing darkness. As they approached the door, it swung open to reveal Eric, their son, his young face bright with curiosity. "Father, I was beginning to worry." The boy's words died as his eyes fell upon their unexpected guest. Eric had his grandfather's height and his mother's keen intelligence, but tonight he looked very young as he stared at the legend walking into his home. Like all children of the Northlands, he had grown up on tales of Queen Solveig's courage and tragedy. To see her alive and in their house was like watching the dead rise from their barrows. "Eric," Thorlund said gently, "help your mother prepare the guest chamber. A visitor will need warm clothes and a hot meal." The boy nodded wordlessly and hurried to obey, but Thorlund caught the questions burning in his eyes. There would be explanations needed, conversations that would challenge everything Eric thought he knew about the world. As Astrid busied herself with preparations, Thorlund found himself alone with Solveig near the great hearth. The fire cast dancing shadows across her face, and for a moment he could see echoes of the vibrant woman she had once been. "Your family is beautiful," she said softly. "You have built something good here." "I have," he agreed, "and I will not see it destroyed, nor would I ask that of you. But Thorlund, if we do nothing, Grimvar will destroy it anyway. He takes more each year. How long before he decides your lands would make a fine addition to his holdings? How long before your son is pressed into service for his wars of vanity?" The question struck home because Thorlund had been asking them himself. Already, there were rumors that Grimvar planned to institute a new tax, young men for his personal guard. The thought of Eric being torn from his peaceful life to serve that monster made Thorlund's blood run cold. "What exactly are you asking of me?" he said. "I'm asking you to remember who you were before you became who you are now. I'm asking you to remember that some things are worth fighting for." Astrid returned with dry clothes and steaming broth, and the conversation paused while they tended to their guests' immediate needs. But Thorlund could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging in the warm air of his home. Decisions loomed ahead, choices that would determine not just his family's fate, but the future of everyone under Grimvar's cruel rule. As the night deepened and the storm raged outside, Thorlund found himself caught between two worlds, the peaceful life he had built and the violent past that called to him through Solveig's haunted eyes. In the morning, everything would be different. The simple certainties of his farmer's life were already crumbling like frost in the spring sun. But tonight, there was only the warmth of the fire, the steady breathing of his sleeping family, and the quiet presence of a queen who refused to stay dead. Tomorrow would bring its own storms, but they would face them when the sun rose. For now it was enough to be alive, to be together, and to know that even in the darkest times, hope could still walk disguised as a beggar through the snow. Dawn brought no relief from the storm, but it did bring clarity to the shadows that had danced in Thorlund's mind through the sleepless night. He found Solveig in the kitchen, helping Astrid prepare the morning meal with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to make herself useful wherever shelter was offered. "You didn't sleep either," Astrid observed, noting the dark circles under her husband's eyes. "How could I?" He accepted the wooden cup of hot ale she pressed into his hands, grateful for its warmth. 15 years of questions demand answers. Solveig looked up from the bread she was slicing, her movements careful and deliberate. Even in borrowed clothes, Astrid's winter dress taken in and shortened, she carried herself with unconscious dignity. "Then ask them," Eric burst through the door, stamping snow from his boots and shaking it from his hair. At 17, he had the restless energy of youth, always eager for the next task or adventure. But this morning his face was pale, with the weight of secrets too large for his young shoulders. "Father," he said urgently, "riders approach from the south. 6 men, maybe 7. They carry Grimvar's banner." Thorlund set down his cup with a sharp click.
"How far?"
"An hour, maybe less in this weather." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Solveig's hand had stilled on the bread knife, her knuckles white with tension. "They come for the winter tribute," Thorlund said grimly. "It's early this year. Or they come because someone whispered that a dead queen draws breath again," Solveig said quietly. Astrid moved closer to her husband, her face tight with worry.
"What do we do?"
Before Thorlund could answer, Solveig stood and began untying the cloak Astrid had lent her. Beneath it, she wore the same tattered garments she had arrived in, the purple wool so faded it looked grey, the silver thread dulled to the colour of old pewter. But as she pulled the familiar rags around her shoulders, something shifted in her bearing. "I return to the gate," she said simply. "I become the beggar again." "No," the word came out harder than Thorlund intended. "You'll freeze before midday." "I've survived worse than cold, old friend." Solveig's smile held no warmth. 15 winters of worse. She moved toward the door, but Thorlund stepped into her path. "Tell me first. Tell me how you survived the burning ship. Tell me what you've been doing all these years." Solveig paused, her hand on the wooden latch. When she turned back, her eyes held the weight of accumulated sorrows. "The ship burned, yes, but I was not on it when the flames took hold. Halvard, Grimvar's own brother, came to me the night before the final battle. He warned me that the revolt would fail, that spies had betrayed our plans. He offered me a choice, die with honor or live to fight another day. Halvard." Eric's voice cracked with surprise. "But he serves at Grimvar's right hand." "He serves, yes. But his loyalty lies elsewhere." Solveig's expression grew distant. "His conscience has troubled him since the day his brother first raised his hand against innocent folk. For 15 years, Halvard has fed me information, helped me understand how the kingdom bleeds under Grimvar's rule." Thorlund felt pieces of a vast puzzle clicking into place. The reports of unrest in the eastern villages, the missing tax collectors, the supply wagons that never reach their destinations. "You begin to see," Solveig nodded. "I have not spent these years hiding. I've spent them learning, watching, preparing. The beggar sees everything, Thorlund. People speak freely around someone they believe beneath their notice." A horn blast echoed across the village, low and commanding. Grimvar's riders had arrived. "Go," Astrid said urgently to Solveig. "Take the back path to the gate. We'll keep them busy here as long as we can." But Solveig shook her head. "No more hiding, no more deception. If I am to ask others to risk everything, I must be willing to do the same." She reached into the folds of her tattered cloak and withdrew something that made Thorlund's breath catch in his throat. It was a ring, simple gold set with a blood-red stone, carved with the ancient seal of the Northern Isles. The signet ring of the royal house, proof of legitimate rule that could not be forged or replicated. I am Solveig Ravenswood, daughter of Olaf Ironhand, rightful queen of the Northern Isles, she said, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded armies. And I call upon every free man and woman to remember what we once were before Grimvar made us slaves. The horn sounded again, closer now. Through the window, Thorlund could see villagers emerging from their homes, gathering in the common square with the reluctant obedience of people who had learned not to keep Grimvar's men waiting. Eric, Thorlund said quietly, fetch my father's hammer from the back room. Father, do it! The boy ran to obey, returning moments later with the ancient weapon. The iron head was darker than night, inlaid with silver runes that caught the firelight. Magnus Eriksson had carried it through a dozen battles, and before him his father had wielded it in the Great War against the southern kingdoms. It was a weapon that had never known defeat. Thorlund hefted the familiar weight, feeling the worn leather grip conform to his palm like an old friend's handshake. For 15 years it had hung silent on the wall, a relic of more violent times. But the balance was still perfect, the edges still keen. You mean to stand with me, Solveig said. It was not a question. I mean to stand with my people, Thorlund replied. If that means standing with you, so be it. Astrid stepped forward and placed her hand over his on the hammer's grip. Then we stand together, all of us. Eric moved to join them, his young face set with determination that reminded Thorlund powerfully of his own father. 3 generations of Eriksson men, all shaped by war and the choices it demanded. What you're considering, Solveig said carefully, there's no going back from it. Once you raise that hammer against Grimvar's men, you become outlaws. Your peaceful life ends. Our peaceful life ended the moment his greed turned to our village, Thorlund said. We've been living on borrowed time. Through the window, they could see the riders now, 7 men in dark cloaks, their horses steaming in the cold air. At their head rode Captain Bjorn Skullsplitter, Grimvar's most trusted enforcer. The man's reputation for cruelty preceded him like a shadow. The tribute, Astrid said suddenly. We don't have it. The harvest was poor, and what grain we had went to feed the children through the early winter. Thorlund's jaw clenched. They all knew what happened to villages that couldn't meet Grimvar's demands. Saltmere still smouldered in their memories. Then it begins today, Solveig said with quiet finality. Not as I planned, not when I would have chosen, but as necessity demands. She pulled the royal cloak tighter around her shoulders, and suddenly it didn't look faded anymore. The purple seemed deeper, richer, as if the act of claiming her identity had restored some of its lost glory. The silver thread caught the light like stars. My queen, Thorlund said formally, and dropped to one knee. Behind him, Astrid and Eric followed suit. Rise, Solveig commanded gently. We have work to do, and precious little time to do it. Outside, Captain Bjorn's voice boomed across the village square, demanding the presence of the headman and the immediate delivery of tribute. His words carried the casual arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. Today, Thorlund thought grimly, would be a day of firsts. He stood, his father's hammer in his hand, and walked toward the door. Behind him came his family and his queen, ready to face whatever consequences their choices would bring. The peaceful years were ending, but perhaps something better could be born from their ashes. The storm still raged outside, but inside Thorlund's heart, a different kind of tempest had begun to blow. The confrontation in the village square unfolded like a scene from Thorlund's darkest memories. Captain Bjorn sat astride his black destrier, steam rising from both horse and rider in the bitter cold. His scarred face bore the cruel satisfaction of a man who enjoyed his work too much. By order of Jarl Grimvar, rightful ruler of the Northern Isles, he announced, his voice carrying across the gathered villagers. This village owes 12 barrels of grain, 6 sides of salted pork, and 20 pieces of silver for the winter tribute. A murmur of dismay rippled through the crowd. Old Henrik, the village elder, stepped forward with the painful slowness of arthritic joints. Captain, the harvest was poor this year. The early frost took nearly half our crop. We have perhaps 6 barrels to spare, and those barely. Bjorn's laugh held no humor. Perhaps you misunderstand, old man. This is not a negotiation. The tribute will be paid in full, or this village will share Saltmere's fate. Thorlund felt Astrid's hand tighten on his arm. Around them, he could see fear creeping across familiar faces. Gunnar the blacksmith, pale and drawn. Ingrid the weaver, clutching her young daughter close. Olaf the fisherman, his weathered hands clenched into fists. And if we cannot pay? Hendrik asked, though they all knew the answer. Then we take what we came for anyway, Bjorn replied, dismounting with predatory grace. Beginning with the young and the strong for Grimvar's personal guard. His eyes found Eric in the crowd, and Thorlund felt something cold and violent stir in his chest. The casual way the captain appraised his son, like a farmer examining livestock, awakened instincts that 15 years of peaceful farming had never fully buried. My lord, Henrik tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. Surely some accommodation can be reached. We are loyal subjects of the Jarl. Loyalty is measured in grain and silver, not words. Bjorn began walking among the villagers, his men following like wolves scenting prey. You, boy, he pointed at Eric. You look strong enough. How old are you? 17, my lord, Eric answered, his voice steady, despite the fear Thorlund could see in his eyes. Perfect age for service. You'll come with us. No. The word cut through the winter air like a blade. Every head turned toward Thorlund as he stepped forward, his father's hammer hanging heavy at his side. Behind him, Solveig remained in her beggar's disguise, but he could feel her presence like a fire at his back. Bjorn's scarred face split into a predatory grin. Ah, the boy's father speaks. Do you challenge Grimvar's authority, farmer? I challenge your right to take our children, Thorlund replied evenly. Find your tribute elsewhere. The captain's hand dropped to his sword hilt. Careful, farmer. That sounds very much like treason. Around them, the villagers held their breath. This was the moment that would define everything that followed. The choice between submission and resistance, between safety and honor. Thorlund's hand found the leather grip of his hammer. The weight of it felt natural, right? As if the 15 years of peace had been nothing more than a brief intermission in a longer story. Then call it what you will, he said. The violence that followed was swift and decisive. Bjorn drew his sword in a practiced motion, but Thorlund's hammer was already moving. 15 years of farm work had kept his arms strong, and muscle memory guided the ancient weapon with deadly precision. The iron head caught the captain's blade, turned it aside, and continued its arc to crash against the man's skull with a sound like breaking pottery. Bjorn crumpled to the snow, his blood steaming in the cold air. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then chaos erupted as Grimvar's remaining men drew their weapons, only to find themselves facing not cowering villagers, but warriors awakened from dormancy. Gunnar the blacksmith wielded his great hammer with devastating effect. Old Henrik, moving with surprising speed, buried an axe in a rider's chest. Eric, his grandfather's blood singing in his veins, fought with the fierce joy of youth discovering its strength. When the last of Grimvar's men fell, the village square looked like a slaughter yard. Steam rose from scattered bodies, and the snow was stained crimson in the pale morning light. Mother of gods, Ingrid whispered, staring at the carnage. What have we done? Solveig stepped forward, letting her beggar's disguise fall away like a discarded skin. In the aftermath of violence, with blood on the snow and rebellion in the air, she looked every inch the queen she had once been. You have chosen freedom over slavery, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the square. You have remembered what it means to be more than cattle for Grimvar's slaughter. Henrik, blood spattering his white beard, turned to stare at her. Recognition dawned slowly across his weathered features. My queen, he breathed, and dropped to his knees. One by one, the others followed suit, until only Thorlund and his family remained standing. Rise, Solveig commanded gently. We are all equals in this fight. But even as the villagers stood, Thorlund could see the weight of their actions settling upon them. They had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Grimvar would not overlook the deaths of his men, and his retaliation would be swift and merciless. How long do we have? Astrid asked, voicing the question in everyone's mind. When these men fail to return, Grimvar will send others, Solveig replied. Perhaps 2 days, perhaps 3 if the storm delays them. Time enough to flee, Gunnar suggested. Scatter to the winds, hide in the deep woods. And then what? Eric demanded, his young voice sharp with passion. Spend the rest of our lives as hunted outlaws? Let other villages suffer as Saltmere did? Thorlund felt a surge of pride at his son's words. The boy understood what many of the adults had not yet grasped, that their choice was not between safety and danger, but between a slow death and a fighting chance at something better. The boy speaks wisdom, Solveig said. Running solves nothing. Grimvar's reach is long, and his memory longer. But if we stand and fight, if we show others that resistance is possible, then perhaps we can build something lasting. She walked to the center of the square, her feet leaving prints in the blood-stained snow. I will not lie to you. The path ahead is dangerous. Many of us may not live to see its end, but I have spent 15 years watching Grimvar bleed this land dry. And I tell you now, it does not have to be this way. From the folds of her cloak, she withdrew an ancient scroll, its parchment yellowed with age, but the seal still intact. This is the original charter of our village, granted by my father's father, guaranteeing your rights as free people. Grimvar has made us forget these rights, but they have never been revoked. Thorlund stepped closer to examine the document. The writing was in the old tongue, formal and binding, establishing protections that had been ignored for far too long. What do you ask of us? Henrik said, I ask you to remember who you were before fear made you small, Solveig replied. I ask you to stand with me, not as subjects to a queen, but as free people fighting for the right to remain free. The wind picked up, swirling snow around the gathered villagers. In the distance, smoke rose from their chimneys, promising warmth and the simple comforts of home. But home, Thorlund realized, was more than walls and hearth fires. It was the right to live without fear, to raise children in safety, to work for something more than mere survival. What's our first step? He asked. 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation that transformed the village from a collection of farmers into the beginnings of a resistance. Thorlund found himself amazed at how quickly old skills returned when necessity demanded them. The blacksmith's forge rang day and night as Gunnar worked to turn farming tools into weapons of war. Axes were sharpened, spear points hammered out, and armor patched from whatever metal could be found. But it was the arrival of strangers that truly opened Thorlund's eyes to the scope of what Solveig had been building during her years of supposed death. The first came at dawn on the 4th day, a weather-beaten man named Ragnar, who claimed to be a fisherman, from the coastal village of Sea Haven. But Thorlund recognized the way he carried himself, the careful assessment of defensive positions, the unconscious positioning that kept his back to walls and his eyes on exits. This was no simple fisherman. My queen, Ragnar said formally when Solveig received him in Thorlund's great hall. The stones have spoken. The message has been received, Solveig nodded gravely. How many are ready? Sea Haven stands with you, as does Ironhold and Raven's Rest. The mountain villages send word that they will follow your banner when it flies again. Eric, who had been listening with fascination, leaned forward. Stones? What stones? Solveig smiled at the boy's curiosity. Show him, Ragnar. The grizzled man reached into his pack and withdrew what looked like an ordinary river stone, smooth and grey. But when he turned it over, Thorlund could see carved symbols worked into the surface, ancient runes that meant the Queen lives and gather the faithful. An old system, Solveig explained. From the time before ravens carried messages between holds, trusted people carry these stones to specific places where other trusted people know to look for them. A message can travel the length of the kingdom in less than a week. How many stones are there? Astrid asked. 47 active networks, Ragnar replied. Perhaps 60 if we can reactivate the southern routes. Thorlund felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. You've been planning this for 15 years. Not planning, Solveig corrected, hoping. preparing for the possibility that one day the people would be ready to remember their strength. More messengers arrived throughout the day. A herb woman from the eastern forests brought word that the logging camps were ready to cut off Grimvar's supply of timber for his building projects. A traveling merchant revealed himself as a former captain in Solveig's personal guard, bringing intelligence about troop movements and supply lines. By evening, Thorlund's hall was crowded with men and women who had maintained their loyalty through 15 years of enforced silence, but perhaps the most significant. Arrival came just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. A lone rider approached under a flag of parley, something that would have been cause for alarm if not for the recognition that dawned on Solveig's face. "Halvard," she said, quietly. Grimvar's brother had aged in the years since Thorlund had last seen him. Where Grimvar had grown fat and soft on stolen wealth, Halvard remained lean and hard. But there were deep lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and troubled conscience. "My queen," he said, dismounting and kneeling in the snow, "I come with grave news. Rise, old friend. What word from the capital?" Halvard's face was grim as he stood. "Grimvar knows of Bjorn's death. He believes it was the work of common bandits, but he has ordered a punitive expedition. 200 men will march within the week." A murmur of dismay ran through the assembled resistance members. 200 trained warriors against their handful of awakened farmers. The odds were sobering. "There's more," Halvard continued. "He has also issued a decree. Every village that cannot meet its tribute obligations will be absorbed. The people relocated to work camps, the lands redistributed to his supporters." "Work camps," Eric spat. "He means slave labor." "Precisely." Halvard's expression darkened. "My brother has decided that ruling free people is more trouble than it's worth. He would rather own slaves." Thorlund felt the last of his doubts evaporate. Whatever chance they might have had for peaceful resolution, Grimvar had just destroyed it. There could be no compromise with a man who viewed his own people as property. "How long do we have?" Solveig asked. 5 days, perhaps 6. "The weather may slow them, but not by much." "And the fortress? What of defenses there?" Halvard's smile was thin and bitter. "My brother has grown complacent. He trusts in his walls and his reputation. The garrison is strong, but undisciplined. They expect to face frightened farmers, not soldiers. Can you get us inside?" "Perhaps. There are opportunities. But timing will be critical." As night fell and the planning began in earnest, Thorlund found himself thinking of his grandfather, who had fought in the Great War against the southern kingdoms. The old man had told stories of desperate battles, of impossible odds overcome through courage and clever strategy. But those had been tales told by the fire on winter evenings, entertainment for a child. This was grimly real. Blood and death, and the fate of the kingdom hanging in the balance. "You're brooding," Astrid observed, settling beside him as the council session continued around them. "I'm thinking of the cost," he replied. "How many good people will die before this is over? How many will die if we do nothing?" she countered. "Eric comes of age next year. Would you see him pressed into Grimvar's service? Would you watch him become the kind of man who burns villages for sport?" The thought was like a physical blow. Thorlund looked across the room to where his son was listening intently to a discussion of supply routes and defensive positions. The boy's face was bright with the excitement of impending action, unmarked by the brutal realities of war. How? Long before that innocent enthusiasm was replaced by the hard pragmatism of a survivor. "I won't let that happen," he said quietly. "Then we fight," Astrid said simply. "We fight and we win, and we build something better for our children." The Stone Network had brought more than just messages and allies. It had brought hope, the knowledge that they were not alone, that across the kingdom others shared their desire for freedom. But hope was not enough. They would need strategy, courage, and more than a little luck if they were to succeed. As the planning session stretched into the night, Thorlund began to understand the true scope of what they were attempting. This was not just a local rebellion or a desperate last stand. This was the beginning of a war for the soul of the kingdom, a war that would determine whether the Northern Isles would be ruled by fear or by justice. The stones had spoken their message across the land. The Queen lives, and with her, the hope of freedom. Now it remained to be seen whether that hope could be transformed into reality. The War Council that formed in Thorlund's hall over the following days bore little resemblance to the desperate planning of farmers facing extinction. Under Solveig's guidance, what had begun as a village's last stand was transforming into something far more ambitious, a coordinated uprising that could reshape the kingdom. "We cannot match Grimvar's forces in open battle," Solveig said, her finger tracing routes on the rough map spread across the oak table. "But we don't need to. His strength is also his weakness. He rules through fear, which means his support is brittle." Thorlund studied the positions she had marked. Supply depots, garrison posts, administrative centers, all the infrastructure that kept Grimvar's tyranny functioning. "You mean to cut his legs from under him?" "Precisely. A tyrant is only as strong as his ability to project power. Remove that ability, and he becomes just another aging warrior with delusions of grandeur." Ragnar leaned forward, his weathered face skeptical. "The coastal fortresses are well supplied. They could hold out for months. Not if they're supply ships." "Never arrive," replied Carrie Stormcrow, the former sea captain who had revealed herself the previous evening. Her presence had been perhaps the greatest surprise yet. Everyone knew the stories of the legendary pirate who had terrorized Grimvar's merchant fleet before mysteriously disappearing 5 years earlier. "The southern trade routes are vulnerable." "Too," added Magnus Ironarm, the merchant who had spent years moving goods through Grimvar's territory while secretly mapping weaknesses. "Burn the right bridges, and half his tax revenue disappears." But it was Halvard who provided the most crucial intelligence. "My brother has grown paranoid in recent years. He trusts no one completely, which means his commanders operate in isolation. They're strong individually, but there's no real coordination between them." Solveig nodded thoughtfully. "Then we make them even more isolated. Astrid, how many birds does the village keep?" "Ravens? Perhaps 24. Train them to carry messages. We'll need communication that can't be intercepted by Grimvar's patrols." As the planning progressed, Thorlund found himself reluctantly impressed by the depth of preparation his former queen had undertaken. This was not the desperate gamble of a deposed ruler seeking to reclaim her throne. This was the methodical dismantling of a corrupt system by someone who understood exactly how that system functioned. "What about the crown?" Eric asked during a lull in the discussion. "Grimvar wears it, claims legitimacy through it. Shouldn't that be our target?" Solveig's expression grew thoughtful. "The crown is important, yes, but not for the reasons you might think." She gestured to Halvard, who reached into his pack and withdrew a cloth-wrapped bundle. When he unwrapped it, Thorlund felt his breath catch. It was a crown, but not the crude, overwrought monstrosity that Grimvar had commissioned for himself. This was the true crown of the Northern Isles, ancient gold worked with silver and set with stones that seemed to hold starlight. "How?" Magnus began. "I stole it," Halvard said simply. 3 years ago, when my brother was drunk on victory wine and boasting about his latest conquests. He doesn't even know it's gone." "Then what does he wear?" Carrie asked. "A very expensive fake," Halvard replied with grim satisfaction. "Gold-plated iron with glass stones. He's been parading around in a merchant's trinket for years." The laughter that rippled through the room was harsh but genuine. After years of living under Grimvar's oppression, there was something deeply satisfying about learning that his symbol of authority was as false as his claim to rule. "But legitimacy comes from more than crowns," Solveig said seriously. "It comes from the consent of the governed. That's what we're really fighting for, not my right to rule, but the people's right to choose their own destiny." "Pretty words," Ragnar said. "But Grimvar's soldiers won't care about philosophy when they're putting villages to the torch." "Which Is why we strike first, Thorlund said, the tactical situation becoming clear in his mind. Hit his supply lines, disrupt his communications, make him react to us, instead of acting according to his own plans. Exactly. Solveig's smile held the fierce satisfaction of a predator planning its hunt. We have 4 days before his expedition reaches striking distance. That's enough time to set the kingdom ablaze. The next morning brought the beginning of their campaign. Small groups departed before dawn, each with specific targets and careful instructions. Kari Stormcrow would take her people to the coastal waters, where Grimvar's supply ships moved in predictable patterns. Magnus Ironarm would coordinate with the merchant networks to disrupt trade routes. Ragnar would return to the fishing villages to coordinate harbor defenses. But perhaps the most dangerous mission fell to Eric, who volunteered to carry messages to the mountain villages. The routes were treacherous in winter, but he knew them better than anyone, and his youth would help him avoid suspicion if he encountered Grimvar's patrols. "I don't like this," Astrid said, as she helped their son prepare for the journey. "Neither do I," Thorlund admitted. "But we need those villages, and Eric is the only one who can reach them in time." "I'll be careful, Mother," Eric promised, checking his pack one final time. "And I'll be back within 3 days." As Thorlund watched his son disappear into the forest, he felt the full weight of what they were asking of their people. This was not just his family at risk now, but dozens of families across the kingdom. The success or failure of their rebellion would determine the fate of everyone who had trusted in Solveig's vision of a better future. "Second thoughts?" Solveig asked, appearing beside him as the last of the messengers vanished into the winter landscape. "Many," he replied honestly, "but no better alternatives." "Good. A man who doesn't doubt is a man who doesn't think. Doubt keeps us careful, keeps us alive. And if we fail, then we'll have tried. That's more than most can say." She paused, watching the empty trail where Eric had disappeared. "Your son has his grandfather's courage. Magnus would be proud." "Magnus is dead because he had too much courage," Thorlund said bitterly. "Magnus is remembered because he used his courage for something worthwhile," Solveig corrected gently. "There are worse legacies to leave." As they turned back toward the village, Thorlund could see the changes that had already begun. What had once been a quiet farming community was now a military camp in all but name. Sentries watched the approaches. Weapons were cached in strategic locations, and every conversation centered on the coming conflict. They had crossed the line from subjects to rebels, and there would be no crossing back. The first reports of success arrived on Raven Wings. Kari Stormcrow had struck fast and hard at the merchant convoy sailing from Grimvar's eastern territories, capturing 3 ships loaded with grain and silver intended for the capital. Magnus Ironarm sent word that the bridge at Wolford had suffered a mysterious collapse, severing the main trade route between the mining towns and Grimvar's treasury. Each small victory sent ripples of hope through the resistance network. But it was Eric's return on the 3rd day that brought the most significant news. "They're coming," he announced breathlessly as he stumbled into the hall, his clothes torn from hard travel through winter forest. "All of them. The mountain clans have agreed to march." Thorlund felt his heart leap, even as his mind calculated the implications. The mountain clans were fierce warriors, but they were also famously independent. Getting them to agree on anything was usually impossible. "How many?" Solveig asked, already moving to the map. "Clan Ironbeard sends 50 axes. Clan Wolfclaw brings 30 spears and the best archers in the kingdom. Clan Ravenstorm still exists?" Solveig interrupted, her voice sharp with surprise. Eric nodded eagerly. "Led by Thorun Ravenstorm herself. She says she owes you a blood debt from the siege of Ironhold." "I thought she died in that battle," Halvard said quietly. "So did everyone else. But she's very much alive, and very angry about what Grimvar has done to her ancestral lands." Eric traced a route on the map with his finger. "They'll come down through Raven's Pass, hit Grimvar's column from the side while we engage them from the front." It was a sound strategy, but Thorlund could see the flaw immediately. That assumes we can coordinate our timing perfectly. If the clans arrive too early or too late, then we use the hidden passages, Solveig said, producing a scroll that Thorlund had never seen before. When she unrolled it, he found himself looking at detailed maps of underground tunnels that seemed to honeycomb the entire region around Grimvar's fortress. "How long have you had these?" he asked. "I've had them since I was a child. My father showed them to me when I was Eric's age, in case I ever needed to escape the capital." Her finger traced the branching paths. "They're old, built by the first kings as escape routes and supply lines during sieges. Grimvar doesn't know they exist." Astrid leaned over the map, studying the intricate network. "Some of these passages come up inside the fortress walls." "Exactly. While his attention is focused on the battle outside, a small force could move through the tunnels and strike at the heart of his power." "It's brilliant," Magnus Ironarm said admiringly, "but incredibly dangerous. If even one person is caught in those tunnels, we'll all die," Solveig finished matter-of-factly. "Yes, I'm aware of the risks, but sometimes the most dangerous path is also the only path to victory." Over the next day, the final details fell into place with a precision that spoke to months of careful planning. Ragnar would lead the coastal forces in a feint against the harbour fortifications, drawing Grimvar's reserves away from the main battle. Carrie Stormcrow would use her captured ships to land a force behind Grimvar's lines, cutting off any possibility of retreat. The mountain clans would sweep down like an avalanche at the moment of maximum confusion, and through it all, Solveig, Thorlund, and a hand-picked team would move through the ancient tunnels to strike at Grimvar himself. "Why me?" Thorlund asked during a quiet moment between planning sessions. "You have experienced warriors, people who know the fortress better than I do." "Because you're the only one I trust completely," Solveig replied without hesitation. "Ragnar is brave but reckless. Magnus is clever but cautious. Carrie fights for gold as much as justice. But you fight for something deeper. You fight for the right to live in peace, to raise your son in a world where might doesn't always make right. And if I die in those tunnels, then Eric will grow up knowing his father died for something worthwhile. That's a gift few children receive." The evening before departure brought a gathering that reminded Thorlund powerfully of the old days, warriors sharing stories and songs around a fire, knowing that some among them would not see another sunset. But there was something different about this gathering, something that spoke to the deeper purpose of their cause. These were not professional soldiers fighting for gold or glory. They were farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and merchants, people who had been driven to war by the simple desire to live free. Their songs were not of heroic deeds, but of home and hearth, of children and growing things, of the quiet satisfactions that Grimvar's tyranny had stolen from them. "Listen to them," Astrid said, settling beside her husband as a particularly beautiful ballad filled the hall. "I am listening. No, really listen. They're not singing about conquest or revenge. They're singing about tomorrow, about the world they hope to build when this is over." She was right. The songs spoke of fertile fields and fair markets, of children playing safely in village squares, of old age reached in dignity rather than fear. These people were not fighting to destroy something, but to create something, a kingdom worthy of the name. "Will we succeed?" Astrid asked quietly. "I don't know," Thorlund answered honestly. "But I know we have to try." The pre-dawn departure was a thing of ghosts and shadows. The main force would march openly, drawing Grimvar's attention and allowing him to feel confident in his superiority of numbers. But the tunnel team moved like wraiths through the forest, following paths that Solveig remembered from childhood excursions that now served a deadlier purpose. They reached the hidden entrance as the sun was climbing toward its zenith. The opening was concealed behind a waterfall that had partially frozen, creating a curtain of ice that sparkled in the pale light. Beyond it lay passages that had been dark for decades, holding secrets that could change the fate of kingdoms. "Once we enter," Solveig said quietly, "there's no turning back." "Are you all ready?" Thorlund looked at the faces around him. Eric, who had insisted on joining the tunnel mission despite his parents' protests. Halvard, whose betrayal of his brother would make him an exile regardless of the outcome. Gunnar the blacksmith, whose massive strength would be crucial in the confined spaces ahead. "We're ready," he said. "Then let's go reclaim a kingdom." As they disappeared into the darkness, the sound of distant battle horns began to echo across the valley. The final phase of their rebellion had begun. The tunnels beneath Grimvar's fortress were older than anyone had imagined. As their torches flickered against walls carved from living rock, Thorlund could see markings that predated even the First Kingdom, symbols and pictographs that spoke of ancient peoples who had sheltered in these depths long before castles. "Crowned the hills above. How far?" Eric whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Not much further," Solveig replied, consulting a map so old the parchment threatened to crumble at her touch. The passage should open into the fortress's lower levels just ahead. They had been moving through the tunnels for what felt like hours, though Thorlund knew it couldn't have been more than one. The weight of stone above them pressed down like a physical thing. And more than once he had to fight the urge to turn back toward the distant gleam of daylight behind them. But it was Halvard who first noticed something wrong. "These walls," he said suddenly, stopping to examine the stonework more closely. "They're too well maintained." Thorlund looked where the other man pointed. While most of the tunnel showed the wear of centuries, this section seemed almost freshly carved. The chisel marks were clean, the joints tight, and there was no accumulation of the dust and debris that had clogged other passages. "Someone's been using these tunnels," Gunnar said grimly. Solveig's face had gone pale in the torchlight. "That's impossible. No one else knows about—" The sound of approaching footsteps cut off her words. Heavy boots on stone, moving with the measured pace of guards on patrol. The tunnel team froze, barely breathing as the sounds grew closer. "This way," Halvard hissed, gesturing toward a side passage that branched off into darkness. They barely made it to concealment before a squad of Grimvar's soldiers rounded the corner, their torches casting dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. But these men moved with the confidence of familiarity, not the hesitation of explorers in unknown territory. "How long has Grimvar known about the tunnels?" Eric breathed into Thorlund's ear. It was a question with terrifying implications. If Grimvar knew about the hidden passages, then their entire strategy was compromised. Worse, it meant that Solveig's carefully guarded secret had been betrayed by someone with intimate knowledge of the resistance. They waited until the patrol had passed before emerging from their hiding place. But the damage to their morale was evident on every face. The tunnels, that were supposed to be their greatest advantage, had become a trap. "We have to go back," Gunnar said flatly. "Warn the others." "There's no time," Solveig replied, but Thorlund could hear the doubt in her voice. "The battle has already begun. We can hear it." Indeed, the distant sound of combat was filtering down through the stone, the clash of weapons, the shouts of men, the deep boom of war horns. Somewhere above them, the fate of the kingdom was being decided while they crept through passages that might already be surrounded by enemies. "We continue," Thorlund decided, "but carefully, and ready for anything." They moved forward with painful slowness, checking each intersection and listening at every junction. The tunnel system was larger than Solveig's maps had indicated, with passages branching in directions that made no sense, according to the ancient drawings. It was when they reached what should have been the final approach to the fortress proper that they discovered the truth. The passage opened not into a storage room or forgotten cellar, but into a well-appointed chamber that was clearly in regular use. Maps covered the walls. Not ancient parchments, but fresh drawings that showed the disposition of resistance forces with terrifying accuracy. On a central table lay documents that made Thorlund's blood run cold. "Deployment orders," Halvard said, scanning the papers with growing horror. "Grimvar's been planning for this battle for weeks. He knows about the mountain clans, the coastal raids, even the specific tunnels we're using." "That's impossible," Solveig protested. The stone network was secure. Only the most trusted. She stopped mid-sentence as the full implications hit her. Someone among her most trusted allies had been feeding information to Grimvar all along. The stones, Eric said suddenly. What if someone was reading them and replacing them? What if every message we sent was copied before it reached its destination? It was a chilling thought. For 15 years, Solveig had believed she was building a resistance network. But what if she had actually been building an intelligence operation for her enemy? What if every carefully placed ally, every secret revealed, every plan shared, had been reported back to Grimvar? "We need to leave," Gunnar said urgently. "Now! This is a trap." But even as he spoke, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from multiple directions. Heavy boots, moving fast, converging on their position from passages they hadn't even known existed. "Too late," Halvard said grimly. Drawing his sword, the chamber had 3 exits, and soldiers were approaching from all of them. Torchlight flickered in the tunnels as armed men closed in on their position. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and running out of time. "The map," Solveig said suddenly, grabbing the largest document from the table. "Look at the map." Even in their desperate situation, Thorlund found himself studying the detailed drawing. It showed the fortress from above, with markings that indicated defensive positions, supply routes, and... There, Solveig pointed to a section near the center of the fortress. "The throne room. Look at the defensive arrangements." Thorlund saw it immediately. The throne room was almost undefended, its guards drawn away to reinforce other positions. But more importantly, he could see why. He's not there, he realized. Grimvar's not in the throne room. "No," Solveig agreed. "He's here, in the tunnels, waiting for us." The footsteps were closer now, and Thorlund could see the first glimmers of torchlight in the nearest passage. In moments, they would be surrounded with no hope of escape. "Eric," he said quietly to his son, "there's a message I need you to carry. Father, listen to me. Get to the surface. Find our forces and tell them the truth, that this was all a trap, that Grimvar knows everything. Tell them to scatter, to survive, to fight another day. I won't leave you. You will, because someone has to warn them. Someone has to make sure our people aren't slaughtered because of our mistakes." Before Eric could protest further, Solveig had found what she was looking for, a hidden panel in the chamber wall that opened onto a narrow shaft leading upward. "This leads to the stables," she said. "You can reach the courtyard from there. What about you?" Eric demanded. "We're going to finish what we came here to do," Thorlund replied. "Even if it kills us." The young man's face was tight with anguish, but he was his grandfather's grandson. He understood duty even when it broke his heart. "I love you, father, and I love you, son. Now go." As Eric disappeared up the shaft, the first of Grimvar's soldiers appeared in the tunnel entrance. But instead of the expected attack, they simply formed ranks and waited. A new figure emerged from the shadows behind them, a man who looked very much like Halvard, but carried himself with cruel confidence rather than troubled conscience. "Hello, brother," Grimvar said pleasantly, "and my dear departed queen. How lovely to see you both again." The trap had been perfect, 15 years in the making. But as Thorlund gripped his father's hammer and prepared for what might be his final battle, he realized that sometimes even perfect traps could have unexpected consequences. The real question was whether they would live long enough to discover what those consequences might be. Grimvar had changed. In the 15 years since Thorlund had last seen him, where once there had been a lean, ambitious warrior, now stood a man grown soft on stolen wealth, his belly straining against rich robes, his face flushed with the permanent red of too much wine. But his eyes remained sharp and calculating, the eyes of a predator who had learned patience. "You know," Grimvar said conversationally, stepping into the chamber while his soldiers maintained their positions, "I have to thank you, Solveig. 15 years of wondering what dissatisfied peasants were thinking, and you provided me with a comprehensive intelligence network. Every village that harbored rebellious thoughts, every merchant who skimmed from my taxes, every fisherman who dreamed of better days, all neatly catalogued and reported through your stone network." Solveig's face had gone ashen, but her voice remained steady. "How long have you known?" Since the very beginning, my dear departed queen. Grimvar's smile was genuinely pleased, as if sharing a clever joke with old friends. Did you really think my brother's sudden attack of conscience was coincidental? Poor Halvard has been reporting your every move for 15 years, haven't you, brother? Thorlund felt the bottom drop out of his world as he turned to look at Halvard. The man's face was a mask of misery, but there was no denial in his eyes, only the terrible shame of someone who had betrayed everything he claimed to believe in. Why? Solveig whispered. Because Grimvar has my daughter, Halvard said quietly. Has had her since she was 7 years old, hidden away where only he knows her location. Every year I receive proof that she still lives, a lock of her hair, a drawing in her hand. Every year, the promise that if I continue to serve faithfully, she will remain safe. Astrid, Gunnar breathed. Little Astrid Halvard's daughter. We thought she died in the plague. No plague, Grimvar confirmed cheerfully. Just a father's love turned to my advantage. Amazing what a man will do to protect his child, isn't it, Thorlund? Speaking of which, I hope young Eric makes it safely to the surface. It would be such a pity if he were to suffer an accident in those dangerous tunnels. Thorlund's grip tightened on his hammer, every muscle tensing for violence. But Grimvar raised a casual hand, and a dozen crossbows appeared in the tunnel entrances, all aimed at the small group of rebels. Please, don't do anything rash. We have so much to discuss before I decide how you're going to die. What do you want? Solveig demanded. Want? My dear queen, I already have everything I want. A kingdom that obeys without question, wealth beyond measure, and the satisfaction of knowing that the woman who once commanded armies has spent 15 years as my unwitting spy. Grimvar moved to the table and picked up one of the documents. This is quite comprehensive, actually. Names, locations, numbers of weapons cached. You've been very thorough in your record-keeping. The people will never submit, Thorlund said through gritted teeth. Won't they? They've been submitting for 15 years. Oh, they grumble and complain. They whisper seditious thoughts in dark corners. But when it comes time to actually stand up, well, we saw what happened to Saltmere, didn't we? Saltmere fought back because they had hope, Solveig said. Hope that someone was coming to help them. Yes, and look how that turned out. Grimvar's expression grew uglier. Burned to ash because they believed in fairy tales about dead queens and righteous rebellions. But today, we're going to put an end to those fairy tales once and for all. He gestured to his soldiers, and they began moving into the chamber with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. But instead of attacking immediately, they started arranging furniture, chairs, a small table, even what looked like writing materials. You see, Grimvar continued as his men worked, simply killing you would solve nothing. Martyrs inspire more rebellion than living traitors ever could. But what if the great Queen Solveig were to formally surrender? What if she were to publicly renounce her claim to the throne and acknowledge my rightful rule? What if she were to order her followers to lay down their arms and accept my generous amnesty? Never, Solveig said flatly. Oh, but you will. Grimvar's smile was genuinely warm, which somehow made it more terrifying than any snarl of rage. You see, I know you, Solveig. I know that for all your talk of justice and freedom, what you really care about is protecting people. And right now there are hundreds of people fighting on the surface who believe they're fighting for a just cause. He moved to a speaking tube that had been built into the chamber wall, another feature that hadn't appeared on Solveig's ancient maps. When he spoke into it, his voice would carry to observation posts throughout the fortress. Captain, what's the current status of the battle? A voice crackled back through the tube. The rebels fight bravely, my lord, but they're outnumbered 3-1. The mountain clans are trapped in the western approach, and the coastal forces are surrounded at the harbor. They cannot retreat and they cannot advance. Casualties? Heavy on both sides, my lord. Perhaps 200 dead already, with more falling by the minute. Grimvar turned back to his prisoners with satisfied expression. 200 dead, and the battle has barely begun. How many more will die while you cling to your pride, my dear queen? How many mothers will lose their sons? How many children will be orphaned, all because you're too stubborn to accept reality? Thorlund could see the impact of those words on Solveig's face. This was her nightmare, not her own death, but the deaths of innocents who had trusted in her leadership. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked quietly. "Simple. You write a letter in your own hand, acknowledging my legitimate rule and ordering your forces to surrender. In exchange, I grant amnesty to all rebels who lay down their arms within the hour. They return to their homes, their families, their normal lives, and us. You die, of course, but cleanly, honorably, as befits former royalty. No torture, no public humiliation. Just a quick end to a sad story." The chamber fell silent, except for the distant sounds of battle filtering through the stone. Thorlund found himself thinking of Eric somewhere up above, trying to reach their forces with word of the betrayal. Would the boy make it in time? And if he did, what could their outnumbered allies do against Grimvar's overwhelming force? "There's another option," Halvard said suddenly. "Let me take her place," Grimvar laughed. "My dear brother, you've been taking her place for 15 years, but no one cares about your surrender. You're not the symbol they're dying for." "I could order the surrender," Halvard pressed. "As your brother, as someone they trusted, Grimvar corrected. "When word spreads about your true loyalties, I rather think that trust will evaporate." "No, it has to be her." Solveig was staring at the writing materials on the table as if they were instruments of torture. In a way, Thorlund supposed they were. The pen that would write her surrender order might as well be a blade aimed at her heart. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. "Oh, as long as you like," Grimvar replied genially. "But every minute you delay, more of your followers die. The choice is entirely yours, though I should mention that our observers report the mountain clans are beginning to break. Clan Ironbeard has already lost half their number, and Clan Wolfclaw is surrounded. Such a pity to see such fine warriors die for nothing." Through the speaking tube came another report. "My lord, the enemy's western flank is collapsing. Should we press the attack?" "By all means, Captain." No quarter for armed rebels. Solveig closed her eyes, and Thorlund could see her shoulders trembling with the weight of decision. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort or counsel, but what words could ease the burden she carried? She had spent 15 years planning for this moment, only to discover that every step had been guided by her enemy's hand. "There has to be another way," Gunnar said desperately. "There is," Grimvar agreed. "You could all die fighting. Take a few of my men with you, and go to your graves knowing that your meaningless sacrifice accomplished nothing except more bloodshed. Personally, I find that option rather wasteful." The tyrant moved to a window that looked out over the fortress courtyard. From their position in the lower levels, they couldn't see much, but the sounds of battle were growing closer. "Ah," Grimvar said with satisfaction. "It appears the first wave of retreating rebels has reached the courtyard. Shall we watch them die, or shall we prevent further slaughter?" Solveig's eyes opened, and Thorlund saw something there that made his heart sink. It was the look of a leader accepting an impossible burden, a queen choosing her people's survival over her own honor. She reached for the pen. Solveig's hand trembled as she reached for the pen, and in that moment of hesitation, Thorlund saw something that changed everything. It was the smallest movement. Halvard's hand sliding to a concealed dagger at his belt, his eyes flicking toward the speaking tube on the wall. A desperate plan forming in the mind of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Wait," Thorlund said quietly, understanding flooding through him. But before he could act on that understanding, the chamber erupted into chaos. Halvard moved with surprising speed for a man who had carried the weight of betrayal for 15 years. His dagger finding the throat of the nearest guard, even as Gunnar's massive fist crashed into another soldier's skull. Thorlund's warhammer came alive in his hands, the ancient weapon singing through the air with deadly precision. The confined space worked against Grimvar's numerical advantage. Only a few soldiers could engage at once, and those few found themselves facing warriors who had nothing left to lose. "The tube!" Solveig shouted, lunging for the speaking device even as crossbow bolts whistled past her head. "If we can reach our forces, Grimvar's roar of rage filled the chamber as he drew his own sword, the blade that had once belonged to Solveig's father.
Kill them all.
No prisoners! But the tyrant had made a crucial error. In his arrogance, he had positioned himself too close to the fighting, trusting in his soldiers to protect him. Now he found himself trapped in a melee where his soft years of comfortable rule were a deadly disadvantage. Thorlund pressed forward, his hammer dealing death with every swing. These were not the skilled warriors of Grimvar's elite guard. They were tunnel fighters, men chosen for their ability to move quietly rather than their combat prowess. Against farmers turned desperate, they were finding themselves outmatched. "Brother!" Halvard called out as he engaged two soldiers simultaneously. "The girl, where is she?" "You'll never—" Grimvar's words were cut off as Solveig's recovered sword pressed against his throat. Somehow, in the swirling chaos of the underground battle, the deposed queen had managed to circle behind the tyrant. Now she held him at blade point, while the last of his soldiers fell to Gunnar's inexorable advance. "Call off your forces," she commanded, her voice carrying all the authority of her royal blood. "Never," Grimvar snarled, but there was fear in his eyes now. "Even if you kill me, my captains will continue the fight." "They have their orders." "Then give them new orders," Thorlund said, wiping blood from his hammer's head. "Call for a temporary truce. Give our people a chance to withdraw. And why would I do that when victory is within my grasp?" It was Halvard who provided the answer, his voice carrying a weight of desperate hope. "Because I know where your treasury is hidden. The real one, not the decoy vaults you've shown your advisors. 15 years of reports, remember? I know about the cave system beneath the eastern tower, about the secret passages you've used to move gold when you didn't want your own people to know how much you were stealing." Grimvar's face went white. "You wouldn't dare. My daughter is more important than your gold," Halvard replied simply. "Tell me where she is, and the location of your treasury dies with me. Refuse, and I'll make sure every rebel in the kingdom knows exactly where to find your life's work." Through the speaking tube, they could hear sounds of continued battle. But there was something different now, a change in the rhythm that suggested their forces were no longer simply being slaughtered. "Eric," Thorlund breathed, hope rising in his chest. The boy made it through. Indeed, through the distant sounds of combat came something that made Grimvar's face twist with rage, the clear notes of a war horn playing the ancient call for Solveig's truth, the rally cry of the old kingdom. Eric had not only reached their forces, but had somehow convinced them to continue fighting despite the odds. "Your nephew is more resourceful than you gave him credit for," Solveig observed, her blade still pressed to Grimvar's throat. "And more inspiring than you feared." "They're still outnumbered," Grimvar protested, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Numbers aren't everything," Thorlund said, moving to the window that looked out over the courtyard. What he saw there made his heart leap. Not when you're fighting for freedom instead of gold. The tide of battle was indeed turning. Somehow Eric had managed to rally not just their own forces, but what looked like portions of Grimvar's own army. Men who had grown sick of serving a tyrant were throwing down their weapons and switching sides, swelling the ranks of the rebellion even as they fought. "It seems your hold on power isn't as secure as you believed," Solveig said softly. "People have limits, Grimvar. Push them too far, and they push back." The tyrant's eyes darted desperately around the chamber, looking for some escape, some advantage he had overlooked. But there was none. His carefully laid trap had become his own prison, and the very isolation that had made it perfect for capturing rebels now made it impossible for rescue to reach him. "The surrender order," he said suddenly. "I'll write it. Call off this madness and I'll abdicate in your favor." "Too late for that," Halvard said grimly. "You had your chance for a clean transition 15 years ago. Now we finish what we started. My daughter will be found and freed," Solveig promised, "but not by bargaining with the man who stole her childhood." Through the speaking tube came new voices, not Grimvar's captains, but the clear tones of rebel leaders coordinating their advance. The fortress was falling, and with it, the last pillar of Grimvar's tyrannical rule. The question now was not whether they would win, but what they would do with victory when it came. The final confrontation came not in the underground chamber where it had begun, but in the throne room of the ancient fortress, the seat of power that Grimvar had corrupted but never truly understood. They had forced him up through passages he had thought secure, past corridors where his own soldiers now stood aside rather than defend a master they had come to despise. The throne room itself was a monument to Grimvar's vanity. Where once the simple stone seat of the old kings had stood, now there rose a gaudy construction of gold and precious stones, so oversized and ornate that it dwarfed the man who sat upon it. Banners bearing his personal sigil hung from every wall, and the ancient carvings that told the history of the kingdom had been defaced with crude additions, glorifying his reign. But it was not the throne that drew every eye as they entered. It was the young woman who stood beside it, Astrid Halvardsdottir, no longer the 7-year-old child who had been stolen away, but a woman of 22 whose eyes held the hardness of someone who had survived years of captivity. "Father," she said quietly as Halvard entered, and the single word carried more pain than any scream could have. Halvard stopped as if struck. "Astrid, my little star, you thought I was hidden away somewhere," she finished. "You thought Grimvar kept me locked in some distant tower, helpless and afraid. You were 7. I was 7 when he took me. But I've been 22 for months now, and I've been his willing ally for years." The words hit Halvard like physical blows. Thorlund saw the man's face crumble as he understood the full horror of what his daughter had become. Not a victim to be rescued, but an accomplice who had chosen her captor's side. "You see," Grimvar said with evident satisfaction, "dear Astrid has been quite helpful in maintaining our little deception. Who better to forge her father's handwriting for our false reports? Who more trusted to carry messages between our agents?" "No," Halvard whispered. "She wouldn't. I would," Astrid said coldly. "I did because, unlike you, father, I learned to adapt. I learned to see opportunity where you saw only shame." The betrayal was never just Halvard's, Solveig realized, her voice heavy with understanding. "It was yours as well. From the very beginning," Astrid confirmed. "Every stone message that passed through our network, every plan you thought was secret, I made sure it reached the right ears." Thorlund felt the ground shifting beneath his feet again, but this time it was different. This wasn't the shock of discovering betrayal, it was the recognition that they had been fighting the wrong battle all along. "You want to know the truth?" Astrid continued, her voice growing stronger. "My father didn't betray you to save me. He betrayed you because I convinced him it was the right thing to do. Because 15 years ago, when your rebellion failed, it nearly destroyed the kingdom. Civil war, famine, brother fighting brother. Is that the legacy you wanted to leave?" "Grimvar's tyranny," Solveig began. "Grimvar's tyranny kept the peace." Astrid snapped. "Yes, he taxed heavily. Yes, he ruled with an iron hand. But the alternative was chaos, was it not? How many died in your first rebellion, my queen? How many children starved when the farms burned and the trade routes closed?" Thorlund found himself remembering the aftermath of that long-ago war, the years of rebuilding, the careful balance between order and justice that had seemed so impossible to achieve. Had Grimvar's brutal efficiency really been preferable to the uncertainty of freedom? "You're wrong," Eric's voice rang out from the doorway, where he had just appeared, flanked by rebel soldiers who had fought their way up from the courtyard. "You're wrong, because you've never known anything but fear." The young man stepped forward, his grandfather's courage burning bright in his eyes. "I've seen what Grimvar's peace really costs. I've watched families torn apart by his tax collectors, seen children press-ganged into his armies, witnessed villages burned because they couldn't meet impossible demands. Better order than chaos," Astrid replied. But there was something uncertain in her voice now. "Better justice than either," Eric countered. "My grandfather died fighting for that principle. My father has lived by it every day since, and I'll die for it if necessary, because some things are worth more than mere survival." "Brave words from a boy who's never seen real war," Grimvar interjected. "I'm seeing it now," Eric replied simply, "and I know which side deserves to win." The moment stretched taut between them, old loyalties and new convictions, the weight of past failures against the hope of future possibilities. Then Solveig stepped forward, her hand extended not toward her sword, but toward Astrid. "Come with us," she said quietly. "Not as your father's daughter or Grimvar's ally, but as yourself. Help us build something better than either tyranny or chaos, and if I refuse, then you refuse. The choice is yours, as it should have been 15 years ago." For a heartbeat, Thorlund thought the young woman might accept. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of the child she had once been, perhaps, or the woman she might yet become. But then Grimvar's hand fell on her shoulder, and the moment passed. "Enough," the tyrant said. "You've had your dramatic speeches. Now face the consequences of your choices." The final battle was about to begin. The battle that ended Grimvar's reign lasted less than an hour, but its echoes would resonate through the kingdom for generations. It was not the clash of armies that decided the outcome, but the quiet choices of individual hearts, soldiers who laid down their weapons rather than defend a tyrant, servants who opened gates instead of barring them, and common folk who finally found the courage to speak truth to power. When the last sword fell silent, Grimvar lay dead, not by Solveig's blade, but by his own hand, choosing a king's death over a traitor's trial. Astrid knelt beside his body, her face unreadable, holding secrets that would take time to unravel. Now, 3 months later, Thorlund stood in his own farmyard, watching the spring thaw transform the landscape. The snow was retreating to reveal green shoots and the promise of new growth. In the distance, smoke rose from village chimneys, not the smoke of burning buildings, but the comfortable haze of homes where families gathered in safety. "The delegation from the eastern provinces has arrived," Astrid informed him, approaching across the muddy ground. Not Astrid Halvard's daughter. That young woman had chosen exile over trial, disappearing into the southern kingdoms with her father's guilt and her own complicated loyalties. This was his Astrid, his wife, whose steady wisdom had become invaluable in the complex work of rebuilding a kingdom. "Already? I thought they weren't expected until tomorrow." "Queen Solveig's reputation for fair dealing spreads faster than our ravens can fly," she replied with a smile. "Every disputed border, every trade disagreement, every question of succession, they all want her judgment." Thorlund nodded, still adjusting to the reality of his former queen's restoration. The coronation had been a simple affair, held not in the grandeur of the capital, but here in his own village, among the people who had made the restoration possible. Solveig had insisted on it, claiming that true authority came from the consent of the governed, not from ancient ceremonies in distant halls. "Will you join us for the negotiations?" Astrid asked. "Later, perhaps. Eric needs help with the new charter." Their son had thrown himself into the work of governance with the same passionate intensity he had brought to the rebellion. At 18, he was officially too young to hold formal office, but his role as keeper of the village charter had become a model for other communities seeking to establish their rights and responsibilities. The charter itself lay spread across a table in the great hall, not the ancient document that had sparked their resistance, but a new one, written in the clear hand of someone who had learned to value both tradition and progress. It established principles that would govern not just their village, but dozens of others across the kingdom. The right to choose their own leaders, the obligation to contribute fairly to the common good, the promise that no one would be taxed beyond their ability to pay. "The mountain clans want to add a provision about mining rights," Eric reported as his father entered the hall. "And the coastal villages are concerned about fishing boundaries." "Reasonable concerns," Thorlund replied, studying the latest proposed amendments. "What does the Queen think?" "She says the charter should be a living document, one that grows and changes as the people's needs evolve." Eric looked up from his writing. "Father, do you think we've done the right thing?" Sometimes I wonder if Astrid, the other Astrid, had a point about the value of stability. It was a question that haunted many of the former rebels. The transition from Grimvar's iron rule to Solveig's more flexible governance had not been without difficulties. There had been disputes over land rights, arguments about taxation levels, and the inevitable friction that arose when people who had lived under tyranny suddenly found themselves free to voice their disagreements. Change is never easy, Thorlund said carefully. But the alternative was to accept that fear should govern free people. I'd rather deal with the messiness of democracy than the efficiency of oppression, even when that messiness means former enemies sitting in council together. Thorlund followed his son's gaze to where Halvard sat at a side table, working on correspondence with various provincial leaders. The man had aged visibly since his daughter's defection, but he had also found a kind of peace in honest service. Solveig had offered him exile or execution. He had chosen instead to remain and work toward redemption, especially then, Thorlund replied. Forgiveness is harder than revenge, but it builds stronger foundations. A commotion outside drew their attention to the window, where they could see Queen Solveig returning from her morning ride. She moved with an ease that had been absent during her years of exile, her bearing once again that of someone comfortable with authority. But there was a difference too, a gentleness that spoke to lessons learned through suffering. The Eastern delegation brings news from the capital, she announced as she entered the hall. Construction of the new Hall of Assembly is ahead of schedule. Representatives from every village will be able to gather there by midsummer. And the southern kingdoms? Astrid asked, still testing our resolve, but without much conviction. News of our stability has reached their courts. Apparently, a kingdom governed by consent rather than force is an attractive trading partner. Thorlund felt a deep satisfaction at those words. This was what they had really been fighting for, not the glory of military victory, but the quiet success of people governing themselves wisely. It was slower than tyranny, messier than autocracy, but it was built on foundations that could weather any storm. As evening fell and the day's work concluded, Thorlund found himself once again walking the path to the village gate where his story had begun. But tonight, there was no beggar waiting in the shadows, only the promise of spring and the certain knowledge that kindness, freely given, could indeed change the world. The kingdom still faced challenges, still struggled with the growing pains of freedom. But it was their struggle now, their choices, their future to build. And that, Thorlund reflected as he turned toward home and the warm light spilling from his windows, made all the difference.